Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Donvan. You'll know more about me in a little bit as I'll be moderating the debate, but first I wanted to reintroduce the president of the Human Rights Foundation, Selina Saf-Bustani, and the CEO of my organization, Open to Debate, Clea Connor.
Welcome back, everyone. I've been coming and working for the Oslo Freedom Forum for 12 years, and I still enjoy every minute, of course. But one thing I've noticed is the most profound things happened outside the theater, when people are having conversations in the hallway, during lunch, during the evening dinners. This is where people are, debating, discussing topics, what happened at the theater, but also this is where the guests' worldviews are challenged. So we thought this year, why not bring this piece of the experience on the stage of the Oslo Freedom Forum? Why not bring a live debate and discuss a timely, nuanced, and very important topic for this community, which is sanctions? So for that, we partner with the best debate platform, Open to Debate. And Clea, why don't you share about the organization?
Thank you, Celine. Thank you so much for having us into the Human Rights Foundation. Open to Debate is the only nonprofit, nonpartisan debate forum promoting the free exchange of ideas in our divided world in the United States. We're fierce advocates for the freedom of speech and creating a contempt-free zone where dissenting and opposing points of view can be heard. And this partnership is so important because we need a model for driving global cooperation more than ever. So thank you for having us here. And with that, I want to turn it over to the Open to Debate Moderator-in-Chief, John Donvan.
Thank you. We're going to get started with a little bit of visual assistance, something we want you to watch. From Russia to Iran to Venezuela, sanctions have become a go-to response in fighting repressive regimes, freezing assets, cutting off trade, restricting travel, all efforts to pressure governments without resorting to force. Supporters argue they're a vital tool to hold leaders accountable and support democratic movements under threat. But critics say sanctions often backfire, hurting civilians, deepening humanitarian crises, failing to bring real change. So as authoritarianism rises around the globe, Open to Debate, in partnership with the Human Rights Foundation, asks this pressing question: are sanctions an effective policy tool? Each debater has 2.5 minutes in the first round to make an opening statement to tell us why they're answering yes or no to our question, which is, are sanctions an effective policy tool? And speaking first will be Leopoldo Lopez, a Venezuelan opposition leader and pro-democracy activist, founder and national coordinator of the Voluntad Popular political party. Leopoldo, you are answering that sanctions are an effective policy tool. You're answering yes. The floor is yours to please tell us why.
Thank you. Thank you to the Oslo Freedom Forum, to Open to Debate. I come to this debate not as a policy analyst, not as someone from outside the place where the sanctions should be imposed. I come as a Venezuelan, as one of tens of thousands of Venezuelans that have been imprisoned over the past years. I was myself imprisoned for 7 years. As one of almost 9 million Venezuelans that have been forced into exile. And as one of almost 90% of Venezuelans that voted and would have voted if given the opportunity to do so last July to promote change through democracy and the ballot box. So I come to this debate with skin on the game. And we have been thinking about sanctions and many other tools for many, many years. Let me be clear. Sanctions by themselves are not a silver bullet. By themselves, they won't produce the objective. The objective being transition to democracy, respect to the will of the people, respect to human rights, and respect to free and fair elections. Sanctions are a way of putting pressure into the regimes. The alternative to sanctions, as we have seen between 2022 and 2024, is appeasement. Today, you might hear that sanctions are at the core or the root cause of economic collapse and humanitarian tragedy in Venezuela. False. The economic collapse in Venezuela started way before sanctions were imposed. Sanctions were imposed almost a decade before price controls, before the expropriation of private property in Venezuela, before the collapse of PDVSA. You might also hear today that sanctions promote migration. Venezuela has the largest migration crisis in the planet. As I said, almost 9 million Venezuelans of a population of 30 million. During the period where sanctions were lifted, in fact, the largest number of Venezuelans crossed the border. You might also hear that sanctions don't have an effect, but they who argue this won't present a path forward to presenting a clear path from autocracy to democracy. So in order to end, I need to say, sanctions by themselves won't get us to democracy. Sanctions as part of a strategic policy framework and a strategic commitment from the Venezuelan people will bring us from autocracy to democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leopoldo. Our next debater is Christopher Sabatini. Christopher is a senior fellow for Latin America at Chatham House, formerly a lecturer at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Chris, you are answering no to the question. You're saying that sanctions are not an effective policy tool.
Thank you. I come here as a policy analyst, not as someone who suffered under the hands of an autocrat like Leopoldo, whose cause I fought for when he was in prison. And I'm not here to talk about the merits of Magnitsky sanctions. Those are very important. Those jailers who held Pedro in the embassy, those jailers who are now holding and torturing Rocio San Miguel deserve to pay for their consequences for what they do. They deserve to have their assets frozen. They deserve to not be able to travel to the United States and Western countries. What I am talking about, though, are commercial and financial sanctions. Analysis that we did at Chatham House, we're still doing, is that as of 2023, there were 600 economic and financial sanctions all over the world. 600 and those stretch from 1950 until the end of 2023. They include, of course, the sanctions on Cuba since 1962. 63 years we've been waiting for change under sanctions in Cuba. Why is that? I'm not going to argue whether these economic problems were caused by the sanctions. In many cases, these are failed economic policies. What we did at Chatham House is we looked at the entire scope of sanctions from 1950 until 2023. That included 1,596 sanctions. And we looked at which ones failed, which ones were successful, which ones were ongoing. Of those, and these are only sanctions that are focusing on human rights, democracy, and regime change. Of those 1,596 sanctions, 400 were successful. 113 failed, and a little over 200 are still ongoing, including those Cuba sanctions, by the way. Now, why? When you look at what countries were the ones in which the sanctions worked, where they're successful, it was semi-democratic countries. Fiji, Chile post-transition, Poland post-transition. When you look at where they failed, they were in autocratic regimes. Cuba, Belarus, China, Myanmar, Burma. Why? It's what a scholar at Tufts University calls a sanctions paradox. Sanctions work more on open regimes. And we can imagine why they wouldn't work in the case of autocrats, is they allow autocrats to consolidate assets that were left behind and redistribute them to their cronies. They also allow for the consolidation of an international axis of the malign. We see this with China, Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela. That's the real risk that we're facing. And we're also facing now over-sanctioning in ways that will weaken the dominance of the dollar and weaken Western financial systems like SWIFT.
Thank you, Christopher Sabatini. Next up, I want to welcome Artie McConnell. Artie is a former federal prosecutor and currently a partner at Baker Hostetler LLP and part of their white-collar investigations and security enforcement and litigation team. Artie, you are answering yes to the question. Sanctions are an effective policy tool. Your opening statement, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sanctions are not only an effective foreign policy tool, I would argue that they are one of the most effective means in which we have to influence real change around the world. They are very easy to criticize. We've heard some of that criticism already. But if you take a broader look at the track record that sanctions have, you can see the impact, and really the results speak for themselves. Just a few examples. Sanctions are credited with helping bring about the end of apartheid in South Africa. They certainly have played a role in keeping nuclear weapons out of the hands of Iran and Libya. As we sit here right now, sanctions play a critical role in making sure that Western-produced military-grade electronics do not reach battlefields in Ukraine and Yemen and elsewhere. And sanctions have played really an instrumental role in changing the compliance culture in financial institutions around the world, making it far more difficult for terrorists, organized crime groups, and kleptocrats to fund their activities and launder the proceeds. But the most effective sanctions are the sanctions that never have to be implemented. There is a deterrent effect to the current sanctions that are in place that I think our opponents fail to perceive. What that means is that countries, companies, individuals will proactively change their behavior to avoid being sanctioned and to avoid being hit with secondary sanctions by the United States and by the European Union. That deterrent effect, ladies and gentlemen, is real. It is hard to quantify, it is hard to measure, but the impact is real. Finally, I would say that sanctions, in certain circumstances, really are effective because they are a moral imperative. What do I mean by that? There are certain situations where it simply cannot be business as usual with regimes that tyrannize and oppress their own people and who make war against their neighbors. And in those situations, sanctions are effective because they help promote our values, they help promote respect for international norms. Sanctions are a unique tool that we in the West, by virtue of our economic power, are privileged to wield, and while we should do so responsibly, we should do it aggressively. Thank you.
Thank you, Artie. And finally, I want to welcome Elizabeth Shackelford. Elizabeth is a former diplomat in the U.S. State Department and author of The Dissent Channel, American Diplomacy in a Dishonest Age. Elizabeth, you're arguing sanctions are not an effective policy tool, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So sanctions can do a lot of things. They can punish for bad behavior. They can raise the costs for bad behavior on regimes or individuals. And when they are used, I would agree, when they're used as part of a broader foreign policy strategy, over time, they can be part of the leverage that can push for change. But sanctions on their own have a poor track record in deterring or changing bad behavior. Now, despite this, they have become the go-to foreign policy tool for the US government and many of our friends who have followed our path. But the US is by far the one that uses them unilaterally the most. We use them without actually demonstrating an objective, an achievable objective. We don't lay out what our specific achievable goals are going to be. And we very rarely or never actually inform regimes who are the target of it what they can actually do in order to secure sanctions relief. Because of this, sanctions have turned into something that plays little more of a role than signaling our disapproval. And because they've become so ubiquitous, as you heard from Chris, the numbers that we have today are staggering, they have become very watered down even as a signal themselves. The United States government in particular has also been leaning really heavily into maximum pressure sanctions. And those are aiming to broadly weaken the regimes that we target. The result of this has been a change in behavior, but not to further US interests or the interests of the democratic world. These changes in behavior have been specifically designed to undermine the influence and impact of US economic power. And at the end of the day, the path that we're going on now is that we're only going to erode our ability to influence the world. So if you can take Russia as an example, we look at where we were prior to the full-scale invasion in 2022 of Ukraine, and we had a wide raft of sanctions. None of these did anything to deter Putin from his aggression against Ukraine. After that, we levied a wide range of sanctions, the United States with our partners, and those have done nothing to end the war. The stated cause, the stated aim of those sanctions was that we were going to crush Russia's economy so that they could no longer fight the war. That was never a realistic outcome. There were other ones more targeted that we could have focused on. In fact, even if what we had said is that our focus was just to raise the cost for Putin, we could actually claim some victory here. But because we aren't able to, Russia can look at that and use this as part of their rhetorical argument against the West and the United States. So for me, I think that sanctions can be an effective tool, but the way that they're being utilized today is really undermining the influence of us on many fronts.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your opening statements. Now we move on to our second round, and our second round is much more of a free-flowing conversation, which is led off by questions from me. The debaters can also question one another. They can challenge one another. And then we'll come to questions from you in the audience. But just to review what I've heard with Leopoldo Lopez and Artie McConnell arguing yes, and Christopher Sabatini, Elizabeth Shackelford arguing no to the question, are sanctions an effective policy tool? I think that the basic, you agree on the basic premises that if they have an objective, that objective is to advance democracy, to enhance the rule of law, to advance human rights, and in some cases to bring about regime change. You've also both made clear that you feel that that they should be part of a broader policy, so I don't think we're going to be arguing over that. And I think I heard some indication that you support sanctions that are targeted towards individuals and narrow entities, but that the real disagreement here is over the broader kinds of sanctions that we've seen brought historically in over places like Iran, Russia now, in the past, in the continuing past, Cuba, and also in the past, South Africa. I want to take to the side that's arguing that sanctions are not effective. What I heard from your opponent Leopoldo was a kind of broad philosophical argument that not to impose sanctions is a form of appeasement. Can you take that on? What is the message of not imposing sanctions?
I think first of all, it's to recognize that sanctions, there's not one case of regime change through sanctions at all. Mentioned South Africa, but that was a semi-democracy, a racist democracy.
You're going to your practical argument. He's making a broader philosophical argument that it sends a terrible message.
But should we be engaging in policies that simply make us feel good, that simply send a message? Is foreign policy simply virtue signaling, or is it intended to be effective? If it isn't effective, which is the point of this debate, then why are we doing it?
Why are we doing the imposition of sanctions? In the case of economic sanctions, that seems to be the focus of what we're discussing, is to cut the cash flow of the dictatorship. Cut the cash flow. The dictatorship doesn't care about GDP. And this is true for Venezuela and many other dictatorships. They care about cash flow. That cash flow goes to the repressive machinery and lubricates the capacity of the regime to bring more people to imprisonment and to keep the society kneel down to the dictatorship.
Okay, I still feel we're sort of not addressing the question that I think is implied by the question not to impose sanctions and appeasement.
I'd like to add that the signal of using sanctions can be very effective, but not when we hand it out like candy. And so where we've become today is that by what we're trying to do, if we're trying to signal our disapproval and we're spreading across the world so easily, that signal is watered down. I know you don't want to get into like the practicalities of it.
We do.
But if you're talking about cutting off funding, for example, if we're doing that across the board, all of these regimes that we are targeting are going to find a way around it. So the more widespread we use this as a tool in order to share our frustration and our disapproval, the less effective it's going to be in actually achieving aims.
So I think that the fact that sanctions can be evaded, number one, anytime there's a prohibition on anything, you will have a black market, you will have attempts at evasion. I think that shows that the sanctions work, frankly. And I want to go back to the Russia example because I think the dichotomy between what happened after Crimea was invaded in 2014 versus what happened after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 really is instructive on, I think, your broader point. In 2014, Crimea is invaded. Everyone stood up on stages just like this one saying, this will not stand. We cannot tolerate aggression on the European continent. And what happened? We had very piecemeal sanctions. They were not enforced. And a year later, Angela Merkel decided to go forward with the Nord Stream pipeline. That told Vladimir Putin and everyone else that the West's commitment to its values only goes as far as our addiction to cheap gas. In 2022, the sanctions that were rolled out were multilateral. They were extremely comprehensive. They have been enforced aggressively, and I would argue they're having a real effect on the regime and on the battlefield.
Just one thing quickly. The issue, of course, that it's going to starve the regime of money is an old one. We've heard it many times. But let's be honest. An autocratic regime is never going to reach a point where it says, you know what? We can't afford the prisons anymore. We can't afford the bullets anymore. You know, we're just going to give up and pack up and leave. That doesn't happen. They will always find money to survive. And in the case of Venezuela, as Leo knows, unfortunately, they engage in criminal activities, gold mining, narcotics trafficking, human trafficking, money laundering. They will find money to keep themselves in power. Sanctions don't work to cut off that source of revenue. Again, that's not to say they aren't important and they can't be used, but let's not use that as an argument because autocratic regimes will always manage to survive.
Well, the regime has been involved in those activities way before sanctions.
Exactly.
So the relationship between Maduro and the narcotics...
I'm not arguing causality. I'm not arguing causality. I'm just saying they'll have...
So it's not that sanctions are putting the regimes to the path of criminal activities. They have been involved in criminal activities way before. And the argument here being cut the cash flow. Yes, there will be alternatives, as Artie said, but those alternatives are expensive. In the case of Venezuela, if oil is sold through the license given to Chevron and other oil companies, they will sell that oil at market price. If they have to go to the black market and sell it to other markets, they will have to sell it with a 30 to 40% discount. So again, there will be a restriction to the cash flow. And I truly believe that cutting the cash flow of the regime will weaken the cohesiveness of the elite that is ruling, will weaken the capacity to repress, and will create the conditions to do many other things. As I said at the beginning, sanctions are not a silver bullet.
Elizabeth, you made the case, I think, that you, in a sense, you're saying there's sanction inflation, that they've been cheapened and the message has been cheapened, the impact has been cheapened, but your opponent, Artie, is saying that the fact that there is such a readiness to reach for sanctions, particularly on the part of the U.S., has a deterrent effect in other situations. And Artie, you said it's hard to quantify, but I want to see what Elizabeth makes of that argument.
Well, I'm very curious. I mean, I know it's hard to quantify. It's hard to prove a negative, and I'm not aware of any scenarios of countries that have seen what has happened to Russia or others that has actually changed their behavior in response.
Do you have any?
I think that it's, when you look at, and I saw these in cases that I handled as a federal prosecutor, companies and countries will change their behavior in order to avoid being sanctioned. So, for example, if you have comprehensive sectoral sanctions on, say, the Russian energy companies and other countries will stop doing business with those entities to avoid coming under U.S. jurisdiction or to avoid being subject to secondary sanctions. It's a path that has been borne out with Venezuela, with Iran, and now with Russia.
But that's not a deterrent effect that changes their behavior. That's a deterrent effect on other companies so that they don't import or ship their oil. The question is are they effective in actually changing government's behavior? And again, have they been effective in promoting regime change, which we want in Venezuela? Don't get me wrong.
Well, if I can just say on the regime change point, I think the point of the sanctions right now on Russia are to degrade their ability to continue the war. I think if we have to put a label on what the goal is, I think that's really it. And they're clearly having that effect. If you look at the macroeconomic indicators, there's hundreds of billions of dollars that are tied up abroad that they don't have access to. Gazprom itself is attributing tens of billions of dollars in losses to the sanctions. They are telling us that works. There is an opportunity cost to that. And while the Russian economy has been stabilized, it really has only been able to perform in that way because of stimulus that is well in excess of 10% of its GDP. It's simply not sustainable. And I think that's the larger point.
I think we're going to find out if it's sustainable. But one thing to note is that, first of all, that isn't deterrence. That's basically just making it more difficult for this regime to continue down its path. But the Biden administration and in other scenarios has said that our goal is to crush the Russian economy to force them to end this. That is not what's happening, so it looks like a fail. But I think that if you look at what happens with the impact on companies around the world, this is that slippery slope where we have gone because we have not made it clear that there are ways to roll those sanctions back when it's suited. We're not at that moment now with Russia, but when we do that, we cannot push for change in behavior because we also cannot promise to offer sanctions regime. We've seen this challenge in other countries, so you don't have an opportunity to actually see those regimes change behavior because we can't promise relief from that.
I think we would all agree that sanctions require adequate enforcement and an adequate structure for implementation. But that does not take the argument that sanctions are an important policy tool. And yes, the behavior has changed. And since the debate is not just on economic sanctions, but also on targeted sanctions, I can tell you, I myself saw behavioral change. I was in prison for 7 years, and I was able to escape house arrest with the collaboration of military and police officers. And throughout several days, I had conversations with high-ranking officers at my house while I was a prisoner. And I asked all of them, why are you here talking to me? And they all said, after making some other arguments, they all said, because of the pressures that sanctions are imposing to my family, to me, to my spouse. Those that were sanctioned wanted sanctions to be lifted. Those that were not sanctioned but were threatened to be sanctions wanted to be out of that list. So sanctions as a whole, economic and targeted sanctions, are a tool for behavioral change, are a tool to cut the cash flow.
A different dimension on this now is, what's the logic that's involved in a sanctions regime that hurts the population as a whole? You look at, say, Iran, and the sanctions there have had a very, very severe impact on the population there in terms of unemployment, access to health care, ability to travel, prices going up, the currency collapsing, hurts the ordinary people. Is the logic of that supposed to be that the population will become disgruntled with the leadership?
I do think that the logic often is, particularly in the case of a place like Iran, the logic is if we make life so difficult for these populations that they will rise up and help push forward regime change, and we haven't seen that kind of outcome yet. The cost that it imposes on various populations is one that reflects poorly back on the sanctioning country, so in this case the United States, and it can harm our credibility in those countries. The cases where it is different, and this gets into utilizing sanctions as a much broader policy tool, part of one piece of the function is the case of South Africa, where that was part of a series of policies by different countries around the world. The key difference there was that it had buy-in by the local population who supported that, even though they were also suffering from the damages of sanctions. For them, they were pushing back against the regime already. You already had this local uprising, and this was something that was helping the population there. I think that when you don't have that, and when there is no hope of public pushback, political pushback against a regime, it's incredibly damaging to the people, and it also gives the regime an excuse. And again, this is not saying that the sanctions are the causation, but it gives the regime an excuse to say, see, it is Western sanctions that are causing your suffering, not our regime.
Artie, is it in fact ethical to impose sanctions that are going to hurt the population at large?
It's not ethical, and we have to constantly be aware of how we can minimize that sort of damage. But my question is, why are we attributing these side effects to the sanctions and not to the regime that they're being put on? We see it time and time again. The dictators that these sanctions are directed against let food, medicine, other perishables rot on the docks. They misappropriate and outright steal money that's been earmarked for aid. And they use sanctions to oppress parts of the population that they feel are subversive. That is a justification for why sanctions should be imposed in the first place. The sanctions put a premium on resources and money, and they choose to enrich themselves and further oppress their populations.
I think it's difficult to untangle the causality. Certainly, let's take the two cases of sanctions I know well, Cuba and Venezuela. The economic deterioration collapse began well before the sanctions because of bad economic policy, because of corruption. The question is, did sanctions worsen that? And we really don't know. And it goes to the point, again, this is not a binary discussion. The truth is it goes to the point of how to improve sanctions if we're going to use them. And part of that is being able to better track the causality and the effect of sanctions versus bad economic policies. And we're not there yet. But we do know that when there's greater suffering imposed on the people, whether through the economic policies of the government or through sanctions, they don't rise up. That sort of fundamental policy logic simply doesn't exist. People are not overthrowing regimes. Again, basic point. Please cite for me a case of regime change under economic sanctions.
I think that that's the wrong question to ask. Why is it that sanctions feature so prominently in literally every multilateral negotiation involving a sanctioned country? It is the first thing that countries want. what was the first request of the new Syrian regime? To remove the sanctions in exchange for a wide variety of concessions that otherwise would have been impossible. So I just don't...
The evidence being that he's citing that as evidence that the pressure is real, it's painful, and the regimes want it lifted, and that therefore it's got impact, which is our question.
It's a regime change. They're going to pursue a different set of economic policies, but yes, sanctions impose a cost. They're supposed to. So yes, they would ask for them to be lifted. If they're not imposing a cost, why are we doing it?
So I think that there is an important point here. What do people think? Because for years, in the case of Venezuela, opinion polls that were funded by those interested in lifting sanctions told us that 75% of the Venezuelans are completely against sanctions. And then came the elections, July 28th. The people went out to vote. 70% of the people that were allowed to vote in Venezuela, and if those who are in exile, like myself, that were not allowed to vote, would have voted, it would have been 90% of the people of Venezuela would have voted against Maduro. So the people did not buy this argument. The people are very, very clear with the information limitations that they have, that the root cause, the origin, those responsible for their suffering are those in the regime, not the sanctions.
I don't think anyone here is arguing that the main cause of the sanctions is of the suffering is the sanctions. Everyone here agrees that those regimes of that type already have imposed a lot of suffering. The question is, and this gets back to the humanitarian issue, are the sanctions making them worse, and is that worthwhile? Is that worth the effort? And I think here, to Artie's point, sanctions. There's a difference between being right and being effective. And you can be right to sanction a regime like this. It can be absolutely, justifiable ethically. But if it is adding to suffering, and if that suffering is, even if falsely, leading to support for a regime that's in place because they are placing blame for the suffering elsewhere, I just think that these are factors that we need to consider in terms of the effectiveness of the sanctions tools that we use.
I think when we talk about effectiveness, we have to look at it in the context of what the alternative is. If the alternative is to do nothing or to appease, I don't accept that.
But that's not the alternative. That's a false premise. The alternative is doing a much better job with sanctions rather than using them as basically an end in themselves, which today, coming out of the U.S. government, I can say we see applying sanctions as this end, as this successful foreign policy achievement. We need to have very specified outcomes that we're looking for, and we need to tailor those sanctions to reach that.
There's also, I think, an issue sometimes of it's reported. I'm not making the case. I'm just reporting what's kind of out there, and that there's unintended consequences. And I'm taking it to this side because you're arguing for them. You take the case of Russia. There's pretty strong evidence that for some time Putin was able to rally the public around the idea from a nationalist point of view, we're being attacked by the West, these sanctions are their fault, and it actually led to an increase. Again, causation is difficult to nail down, but Putin's popularity went up once the sanctions went into place.
Any government can use whatever they want to construct the propaganda narrative that they are looking to promote, and in the case of dictatorships, they have complete ability to formulate that. The difference is that when you look at the macroeconomic indicators, Russia is in an unsustainable economic situation. They will not be able to continue the war. The other thing about the sanctions that I think are very important to note is, as I mentioned in my opening statement, the Western electronic components that go into drones and smart munitions are the absolute lifeblood of the war machine, and the sanctions have been extremely effective at denying the regime the ability to replenish these as the war goes on. When I was a federal prosecutor, we sent teams over to the Ukraine to look at downed Russian drones, munitions, and other weapons platforms. All of them were filled with Western electronics, I'm very sorry to say. But what we saw is that all of these components, most of these components, let's say, were manufactured prior to the beginning of the war, prior to 2022. And as the war went on, we did not see a replenishment of those components. We saw cheap Iranian, North Korean, and Chinese copies. We saw consumer electronics being cannibalized and put into drones and surveillance equipment. There was one instance where there was a plastic bottle cap that was put inside of a drone to make sure that the camera was functioning. That is empirical proof that the sanctions are working and should continue.
Again, the question is was that a deterrent effect? No, they went ahead and found parts elsewhere. Russians are now turning to North Koreans and putting them on the front lines, or now selling their oil to China. What it did was, again, reinforce this idea and this connection. They may be cheaper parts, but they're still killing Ukrainians. So the war continues. And again, this is not a binary decision, sanctions and no sanctions. But the question is, how do we make them more effective? And also understand the limits of sanctions in both deterring and also throwing sand into Putin's war machine. And that's the question we have to face. And then we have to consider what else we can be doing, working with other countries to help deter and affect and cut off those supplies that are keeping the Russian war machine going.
So, Chris, if you were at the driver's seat, deciding sanctions for the U.S. government, what would you do?
I didn't know I'd be put on the spot. I think the first thing is...
I think that's a really great question.
I think the first thing is, before you apply sanctions, you need to recognize how to design them and also develop, first of all, send a signal of what you expect a clear signal of what you expect from those sanctions, which is often not done. For example, in the case of Iran, there are 3 different sets. We have sanctions on Iran for reasons of its nuclear capabilities, sanctions for human rights, and sanctions for spreading terrorism and destabilizing the region. Those aren't clear. At what point can Iran turn to the international community and say, okay, how do we get rid of this sanction? So the first thing is being very, very clear with the objectives. The second thing is coordinating with allies. In the case of Venezuela, for example, the US is the only one that is applying sectoral sanctions. The EU and Canada are only applying Magnitsky sanctions. So there's also has to be better coordination with other countries so those countries feel the pinch of those sanctions and coordination with those countries in terms of what those objectives are and what needs to be done to meet them. Because let's take again the case of Cuba. The US is the only country in the world that has an embargo on Cuba, and it's been there for 63 years. Unilateral sanctions really risk sort of going on forever and become very, very sticky. They become difficult to unwind. So being very clear what the objectives are and how to meet them will send signals.
Okay, I want to go to audience questions. So the way that will work is if you raise your hand and I can see you, a microphone will be brought to you. But Chris, I want to thank you for taking on that question. That was a tough one.
Fair enough.
And you were very game about it. Any questions?
My question is, in what ways can the sanction on government can lead to this government, and we have many, for instance, Iran, this sanction, the more we impose sanction, the more this government supports, for example, non-state armed group, terrorist group. We have, for instance, in Northern Africa.
Yeah, it's again
Sahara,
unintended consequences would be the category again. And also, I think you could add to that sometimes these sanctionees get together and cooperate with one another. So if you could take that on.
I'll just say quickly, going back also, you can impose sanctions without being a lobbyist, by the way. So this again goes to the point about, but yes, there is a risk that the axis of the sanction, there's about 2/5 of the economy right now, the global economy is under some form of sanctions. They're cooperating. And the long-term risk, we're already seeing this. I know we're not here to pick on democratic governments, but Brazil is leading the charge and working with China. A large part of Brazilian-Chinese trade now is occurring in renminbi. We're watching the erosion of the dollar-dominated global system and the erosion of financial systems that the West dominates because of over-sanctioning. And so, yes, there is collusion going on, and that has to be understood.
Okay, let me just let the other side respond to that as well, if you'd like to.
I think that shows the effectiveness of sanctions, that other countries have to construct these elaborate, very costly, very resource-intensive workarounds. I mean, the dominance of the dollar and the euro and the Western financial system is an extremely important piece of economic leverage that we should wield for as long as we can. There may be a time when we don't have the ability to use it to sanction other countries or individuals and influence change. But right now we do, and it would be a real disservice if we didn't use it.
See, I'm afraid, though, there's going to come a time, and we'll be here, say, 5, 10 years from now, we're like, but wait, what happened to all those tools we used to have? Maybe we overplayed them, and they lost their weight. That's the risk. We need to be aware of this now.
I think that process is going to happen whether we impose certain sanctions or not.
I think it'll be accelerated with sanctions, though. I fear it could be accelerated.
Well, we hear no alternative, Chris.
The alternative is using it much more designed. I mean, not using it so broadly, because right now we're just weakening it and pushing all of these other countries, including other democracies, to use other systems.
What would you redo in Iran, for example? How would you change that? Or
Well, sadly, I would go back to actually what we did achieve with sanctions on Iran. But now, having pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, we have lost our ability. One of the very few times in recent history that the US government has led a complicated sanctions regime as part of a broader set of tools. And we actually laid out clearly what we were going to offer in return. We almost never do that. And now we have thrown that away, so our credibility of the fact that we will actually give that sanctions relief is gone there.
Thank you so much. Okay, one question for Leopoldo then. When you started to speak about the importance of sanctions, you also mentioned the issue of putting it in a real long-term strategy. And how can we achieve this so that we wouldn't be accused of inefficiency? How can we push forward for a better strategy within which the sanctions would become more efficient?
Well, briefly, I think the first step is to have a clear objective. The case of Russia, we heard that the objective was to contain their capacity to continue the war. The case of Venezuela, to promote transition to democracy. Once you establish the objective, then identify a strategic framework where sanctions are part of that. Economic sanctions being part of them, cut the cash flow, but then go after the individuals, the companies, the organizations, inside and outside, that are responsible for repression, for corruption, and for fraud. 3, to create a coordination of all of the countries, democratic countries, that are aligned with that objective. Number 4, to work on implementation issues that are very important. As we've all said, it's not just about the sanctions, it's about the sanctions being enforced effectively. And that requires rethinking the way that US Treasury, the State Department, the intel agencies are organized and coordinated around the issue of sanctions. And I would add one more. I would keep the money of the lobbying interest outside the democratic countries, because I can tell you, we have seen the money, the hands, the fingerprints of those interests of lobbying in think tanks all over democratic countries. And I would also target that because they are going after false narratives in order to make the point that sanctions are not effective.
Okay, it sounds to me very much like the case that you're making is to do sanctions, if you're going to do sanctions, do them really well.
I actually think we'd make a really good task force.
My name is Sebastian. I have a question for the ones arguing the affirmative. So we're dealing with the question of powers, and it is the Western, often weird or Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries that impose sanctions, which means that they act as a sort of moral police in which countries deserve to be sanctioned. So my question is then, how can we promote the voices of non-weird countries to like decide who should be sanctioned or not?
Yeah, well, I would say that it's not about being a moral police. It's about principle. It's about principle. It's about believing in certain principles that should be respected no matter the borders. And I believe that countries that are autocratic, and we have lived through this, we have seen it, they will never, ever be interested in transition to democracy. China, Iran, Russia, Cuba, Nicaragua, and I can go on, will never support transitions to democracy. So the support that we need, we would love to say that the issue of Venezuela or of Cuba, Nicaragua, or any other country should be solved only with the people from our countries. But the fact is that Maduro and many other autocrats are still in power precisely because of the support they get from these autocratic mighty powers. So the engagement of democratic countries is crucial. And it's on principle, but it's also strategic, it's also economic, and it's also about security and stability, because a free Venezuela will lead to a free continent from Alaska to Patagonia and beyond. So it's strategic, it's principled, and it's the right thing to do.
May I just add one quick thing? I think, again, to the point about what I would do if I were in the driver's seat is more consultation with global South countries in the application of sanctions. Because the problem is some of these countries that are not signing on, that are not denouncing, I won't name names, even some Democrats, okay, I will name one, Brazil. They become enablers of autocracy. And so when we impose sanctions, I do think it's incumbent upon the global north to try to bring more countries along. When we think about where sanctions have worked, South Africa, again, a semi-democratic regime, a racist semi-democratic regime, but those sanctions were global. And that's the ones that are most effective, and it requires a lot more work up front and diplomatic to get people behind, other countries in the global south, behind those sanctions.
Everyone, thank you for your questions. We have to move on to our closing round. And in our closing round, once again, each debater takes the floor to make one more time their case for why they're arguing yes or no in answer to the question, are sanctions an effective policy tool? And Leopoldo, you are up first. The floor is yours to make your closing statement.
So, first of all, I want to thank the debate. I want to thank all three of the co-debaters. I think it's very clear to all of us that sanctions are important, that there is an issue of implementation, that there is an issue of focus, that there is an issue of making sanctions smart and making them effective. So I think to the answer of are sanctions an effective policy tool, I would say that the answer is yes, that they can be more effective, yes. What can be done? And I will talk about the case of Venezuela. I would say to have a strategic framework where we have an economic policy sanctions that cuts the cash flow of the regime. And that is also come together with targeting individuals, as I said before. But for closing, I would like to ask, in the context of this Oslo Freedom Forum, to imagine. They've asked us for these 3 days to imagine. So I invite you to imagine. Imagine a world without any sanctions. Imagine that world where autocrats steal the money they want, they plunder, they violate human rights, they take people to prisons, they force migration, and then they go to New York, to Madrid, to Paris, to London, where they buy mansions there. They have their accounts. Imagine that world where there is full impunity, where they can become even richer without sanctions. Imagine that world of impunity. It's not hard to imagine because it's very close to the world in which we're living today. Now, imagine a world where we all come together. Those governments and organizations that believe in democracy, that believes in the basic principles without borders, because human rights, democracy, shouldn't have any borders. Imagine that world where there's actual consequences to stealing, to corruption, to repression, to fraud, where sanctions are effective, where sanctions are part of policy frameworks, not just of the United States, but of European countries as well, to all of the democratic countries. So, to end, just imagine the possibilities of having an effective tool to help all of us who want democracy to transition to democracy. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you.
Next up, in making a closing statement, Christopher, you are up. You've been arguing that sanctions are not effective.
I used to teach at Columbia School of International Public Affairs, and I still teach at London School of Economics. I teach a course on the politics of policymaking. And I always teach my students that every policy has to have a hypothesis. Whether it's increasing the price of sugar or increasing the tax on tobacco will reduce smoking and therefore reduce healthcare costs. You have to maintain that hypothesis. What is the hypothesis that drives maximum pressure sanctions? Is it that elites will defect and it'll cause a change in the government? Is it that people will suffer and rise up and overthrow that government? Because when that hypothesis doesn't work, you need to start to reevaluate what your basic assumptions are. You need to adjust your policy. I think we all here share the same goals. We want to see autocracies collapse. We want to see justice. We want to see people pay for their crimes against humanity. But the question is sanctions as they're currently conceived, do they work? Is our hypothesis about sanctions and maximum pressure sanctions really working? Because I can imagine a much more dystopian future than Leopoldo. Maybe I'm just more of a pessimist. Which is 5 years from now we come back. I don't think I'll be invited back at this rate. But 5 years from now we come back and we suddenly realize that China, Iran, and this coalition of the sanctioned, without understanding the flexibility without the policy tools to make sanctions more effective has consolidated. The dollar is used less as the currency, global currency. The SWIFT banking system has been replaced by a Chinese-led system. The Chinese, through the BRICS and through others, have led a complete global revolution against sanctions with some rather enabling governments. That's my fear. So I think it's incumbent upon us, because we all here obviously believe in freedom, but we also need to recognize that when a policy hypothesis has failed to be proven, we need to recognize and be willing to adjust that policy. Unfortunately, with sanctions, because people get locked in, because they're lobbyists, it becomes too extreme.
Thank you, Chris. Artie, the floor is yours. You have been arguing that sanctions are effective, and it's your last chance to make your case.
I want to continue where Leopoldo left off and ask you to imagine as well. And really, there's one question that matters to you all in a room full of people who I know care very deeply about liberty and freedom and human rights. And that question is, what does the world look like if we adopt our opponent's position? What does the world look like if we roll back existing sanctions without extracting meaningful concessions, or if we fail to implement new sanctions in response to the next human rights atrocity or the next act of aggression? What would that look like? What would the reaction be from dictators, autocrats, and oligarchs around the world? Would our collective inaction cause them or even motivate them to change their behavior? Or would they feel emboldened like never before, knowing rightly that the will to confront them has become feeble and weak? The answer to that question is obvious, ladies and gentlemen, and it should inform your position on this question. Sanctions are not a perfect foreign policy tool. We agree on that. Very few things in international relations are, but they are effective. And we cannot let the well-intentioned and often sound criticisms of sanctions paralyze us into inaction. We do not have that luxury. The geopolitical terrain that we are trying to navigate is simply too complex, and the stakes are too high. I agree with Chris. I think there may come a time when the West does not have the economic leverage that we currently wield, and sanctions will no longer be an option for us when we talk about tools of statecraft. But right now, at this moment in history, to not use our economic leverage, to not impose sanctions, is a disservice to ourselves, to our values, and the causes that we champion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Artie. And Elizabeth Shackelford, the last word is yours. One more time, you are arguing that these tools, that sanctions are not an effective policy tool.
All right. Unlike everyone else, I'm not going to ask you to imagine the future. I'm going to tell you a short story from the past. Back in 2014, I was a Foreign Service officer, a U.S. diplomat, serving in South Sudan. I was there as a civil war, a horrific civil war was raging. And I was absolutely determined to use my position with the U.S. government to push the U.S. government to use the tools it had to do something to stop this suffering. So I was one of many in the government who lobbied hard for us to impose sanctions on the worst offenders of the violence and the conflict. I was incredibly excited to find out one day that we had succeeded in convincing the government to impose sanctions on a handful, just a handful, but this was our first move, on a handful of some of the worst offenders on both sides. A South Sudanese contact of mine shared with me the news of the reaction of one of these warlords from the bush when he found out that the great power of the United States had sanctioned him. He had apparently laughed and said, "Well, I guess I will cancel my trip to Disney World." I recognized this, and I thought about the fact that, there were many other things that we could have done that would have been effective. This was going to have absolutely zero impact on this conflict and on the people who were perpetrating it. The things that we could have done at the time, the better foreign policy tools we had. We were close with Kenya and Uganda. They were close partners of ours in the region. They could have imposed sanctions. We could have pushed them to do the same in a country where their kids were going to school, where they had houses, where they had bank accounts. But we didn't choose to do that because the United States has retreated into the idea that sanctions are an end in themselves, that signaling our disapproval is in some cases enough. Frequently, yes, well, not frequently, sometimes we do have these more elaborate programs, but often we default to using sanctions because we think that it's good enough, that we are right in harming and punishing these people and these regimes that are committing these offenses. But I still believe strongly you can be right, but if there are ways that you can be more effective, it is incumbent upon you and upon the power of a country like the United States to do so.
Thank you. Hey, Elizabeth, can you stay up here? Can everybody come up front here? Can you step up here? That is a wrap on this debate. I just want to say what a pleasure it's been to work with the Oslo Freedom Forum. What a beautiful cause. As you said in your closing, Chris, everybody in this room fundamentally agrees on the core principles. And I think that had a lot to do with what happened in this debate, in fact. But there was robust disagreement. And what you all did with that disagreement was the thing that we want to do at Open to Debate, is show that you can engage on disagreement, on points where you have sharply disagreeing views, but do so in a way that expresses civility, respect, and most importantly, listening to one another. To everybody who asked questions, they were fantastic questions and very helpful, but I really especially want to say to our 4 debaters, thank you very much.